Hello everyone, I am Xiao Gun, an artificial intelligence teacher from the Talent Ecology Development Department. Artificial intelligence has two core technologies. One is machine learning, and the other is deep learning. In the previous chapter, our other teachers explained the content of machine learning. In this chapter, we mainly focus on the fundamental knowledge of deep learning, introduce a developmental history of deep learning, as well as some important components of neural networks. Furthermore, in deep learning neural networks, how to optimize these neural networks, there is also an explanation of different neural networks and what some of their network structures look like. Finally, we will describe common issues encountered in the project and explain to everyone how to solve these common issues. First, let's take a look at what we have learned through this chapter. You can understand some definitions of deep learning and neural networks, and the entire process of its development, being able to familiarize with some important components of neural networks, then get familiar with how neural networks undergo training and optimization, and be able to explain or understand some common issues in neural networks, and some of the methods they use to solve them. With these goals in mind, let's learn the content of this chapter together. The first section is an introduction to deep learning, mainly focusing on the relationship between mechanism learning and deep learning. How is deep learning defined, and how some important algorithms like neural networks in deep learning came into being. Finally, I will explain how deep learning neural networks solve the XOR problem. We will study the content of this section with these questions in mind. First, let's take a look at a comparison between traditional machine learning and deep learning. We all know that deep learning belongs to machine learning. However, since most samples in deep learning are unlabeled, moreover, it excels in neural network learning. The information inside the features is learned layer by layer and step by step, so it is a model based on unsupervised feature learning and feature program structure learning. Due to the ability of neural networks to process a large amount of data, it can also handle some complex calculations between data. So deep learning in handling vision, process voice, and process text, it has outstanding advantages in natural language processing. Next, we will analyze and compare the advantages and disadvantages of traditional machine learning and deep learning from 5 aspects. Traditional machine learning has relatively low hardware requirements, as it does not require calculations between particularly complex mathematical matrices. So it generally does not need to be equipped with a GPU for parallel computing. Deep learning has certain hardware requirements, because in a large amount of data, during our training, that is to say when training our model, it needs to perform a large number of matrix operations, so we need to use GPUs for parallel computing. When comparing data volumes, traditional machine learning is suitable for training with small amounts of data. If the amount of data increases, instead it does not improve the performance of the model. Deep learning can handle high-dimensional weight parameters and the training of massive data, and be able to obtain a high-performance model. Traditional machine learning decomposes problems in solving problems. Deep learning is a black box. It doesn't know what exactly happened inside the neural network, so it goes from data input to result output. It's like an end-to-end learning program. In terms of feature selection or feature collaboration, traditional machine learning requires manual feature selection. Deep learning can use algorithms to automatically extract features, so we generally don't need to do feature engineering manually. No need to do feature selection. Just now we also mentioned, deep learning neural networks are like a black box. So when performing calculations, we do not know what this part of the data represents in terms of the meaning of this word. So the interpretability of features in deep learning is relatively weak. Machine learning utilizes some statistical and mathematical formulas, simulate the distribution of the data, so its data has a strong interpretability, being able to clearly understand what specific features these feature data represent. We have a clear understanding of the differences between deep learning and machine learning. And then the characteristics of deep learning. Let's review a general process of machine learning. In fact, deep learning is also a type of machine learning. So in terms of engineering, its general process is roughly the same. First, let's take a look at a general process of machine learning. First of all, we need to analyze the problem first. Positioning task. It is to identify the target for data mining, then further process the data, mainly include some data cleaning, then extract some features, then select some important features of the data. After handling the data, we need to import this data into the model. Then further train our model. After obtaining a relatively good model, we can apply this model, then push it into the market, inferring on new data, predicting and recognizing this part of the work. So our deep learning can also follow such a process. However, did anyone ever think, feature extraction and feature selection, is it possible to be automatically completed in deep learning? So in terms of process, our deep learning and traditional machine learning, in fact, in terms of feature engineering, there is a significant difference. In deep learning, we don't need to do too much feature engineering work. We often mention deep learning. Also explain some general processes for understanding deep learning. However, what is deep learning after all? Let's unveil a mysterious veil of deep learning together. What we often refer to as deep learning, it's actually a deep learning. In other words, utilized a deep neural network. This deep neural network, the more layers it has, prove that its structure is deep. Sometimes, when dealing with high-dimensional data, deep networks can achieve relatively good performance, because it learns a lot of information. The neural network we use for deep learning, it is actually an algorithm that mimics the brain. When inventing neural networks, scientists also study brain signals, a process of transmission between the brains. Then we understood one of its conduction processes. After understanding the general signal transmission information, we scientists also studied a simple neural network, Perceptron. For example, when the brain processes signals, we are interconnected by different neurons. A neuron has dendrites, has a nucleus, axon, and synapses. When we communicate information, it is through the synapse of the previous neuron, transmit to the dendrite. Transmission of signals between neurons finally arrived at the place in our brain, then the brain makes a judgment. For example, when our eyes see an image, this is a diagram of neuron structure. Then our eyes will generate certain electrical fluctuations, then transmit this current signal through cells one by one to our brain. There are also certain electrical changes produced inside the brain by transmitting from one neuron to another neuron in this way, finally transmitted to the central part of our brain. Then the central brain will judge this as a structural diagram of a neuron. Our scientists also use this form of information transmission, invented a single-layer neural network, Perceptron. This is also the simplest structure of a neural network. It mainly consists of the input layer, hidden layer, and output layer. The input layer is where we import our data into our model. The hidden layer contains some computational functions, calculate the output generated by our output layer. When we are unable to solve some very complex data, we can also increase the number of layers in the hidden layer. To increase the complexity of our model, we added more neurons in the hidden layer. This way you can better learn some structures and information in the data. The design of general artificial neural networks is usually an application research. We usually consider three relatively important aspects. One is a neuron, which has an activation function. Another one is the way neurons are connected, and how the network learns, or how the network is trained. We know that neural networks have many neurons. How is the neural network defined in deep learning? Description of neural networks. There is currently no unified definition. According to a viewpoint of American scientist H13-311, he is defined in this way. Neural networks consist of many very simple processing units, connecting with each other in a certain way, formed a computer system. Through this computer system, based on the state of this computer, process information by dynamically responding to external input. We leverage one of his viewpoints, and some viewpoints of other scientists, and combined with some characteristics of neural networks, how can it be simply represented? In other words, it is a mimicry of the human brain structure, as well as the human brain and functional information processing system. In other words, this information processing system can analyze from the microstructure and function, abstracting the human brain, simplification is a key approach to emulate human intelligence. It can also reflect several basic features of human brain function. For example, it can perform parallel processing, ability to acquire knowledge, to be able to associate, and can classify patterns. There are still some memories, some information fragments these function. Currently, such an information processing system has been widely used in various industries. It has also played a significant role in scientific research. Its performance is even more outstanding than machine learning. However, its development process was not smooth sailing. Let's take a look at the overall development process of neural networks, which is also known as deep learning. The development process of neural networks and deep learning can be divided into 4 stages. Experience 2 rises and falls. Its embryonic period was in 1958, invented the perceptron. In 1969, American artificial intelligence pioneer Minsky discovered that the perceptron still has issues with XOR processing. Unable to classify correctly, Minsky and other scientists jointly proposed the death penalty for this perceptron. From now on, the development of neural networks has become very slow, once unable to be used normally in industry and research. In other words, the period from 1970 to 1986 was artificial intelligence. It is also a cold winter period for deep learning. During the period from 1986 to 1998, it is another part of the development of neural networks. Second-generation neural networks. In 1986, the deep learning guru Hinton invented the BP algorithm for multilayer perceptrons and adopted the sigmoid function for nonlinear mapping. This effectively solves the problem of nonlinear classification. But by 1995, due to the continuous increase in data volume, there have also been some bottlenecks in neural networks. Until 2006, Hinton proposed a solution in deep networks. In other words, using unsupervised training to initialize the parameters, then supervised training for fine-tuning. Thus, 2006 became the first year of deep learning. In 2012, in the top-level ImageNet image recognition competition, Hinton and his team adopted convolutional neural networks, won the championship in one fell swoop, and crushed other algorithms. This also marks the birth of deep learning convolutional neural network. From then on, triggered a wave of enthusiasm for deep learning. Whether in the industrial sector, still in the field of scientific research, convolutional neural networks have been widely applied. Especially in 2016, Google has adopted the deep learning artificial intelligence program AlphaGo, defeated world champion and professional 9-dan Go player, Lee Sedol, once again pushed deep learning to another new height. We have understood its overall development process. Next, let's take a look at the deep learning neural network algorithm. How to develop and evolve step by step. Firstly, let's take a look at the simplest neural network in deep learning. It is also the single-layer perceptron that we just mentioned. Single-layer perceptron, mainly input, activation functions in hidden layers, and the output layer. Its input, just enter one of ours, data vector. In each corresponding data vector, there are some of its corresponding full value. With its full value, when importing our activation function, by activating our activation function, this is multiplied and then added. The result calculated in this way, make a judgment. If its result is greater than 0, so its result is equal to 1, belonging to the positive class, otherwise, it is equal to -1. It is a negative class. When we are doing classification, everyone please note, we use 0 as a boundary point. In other words, transpose of W, multiplied by X, it equals to 0, it is one of its interfaces. If we deal with a one-dimensional one, when drawing a line segment, its boundary point is actually a point. Perform a split on this segment, if it's in two-dimensional space. If we classify it, it actually has a segmentation interface. Is a straight line, three-dimensional, just a plane. If our data is in high dimensions, actually, it is just a high-dimensional hyperplane. 1958, Rosenblatt invented the perceptron. Perceptrons were once widely used. Moreover, compared to other machine learning algorithms, coexisted for about 10 years, but it encountered a very important issue. In other words, we were just in the history of deep learning development. Speaking of an important issue, in 1969, artificial intelligence pioneer Minsky, he discovered the XOR problem. What is this XOR problem exactly? Let's take a look at this XOR problem. Why can't perceptrons perform a solution? If we have an AND problem, for example, this is 0, 0, this is 0, 1, this is 10. If it AND, this part 0, 0 is also 0. 0, 1 is 0. 10 is also 0. So it belongs to a category. It is 0, 1. It is a 1 with a single line belt. We can perform a split. Then we get the answer. It belongs to 0, 10 is 1. 0, 1 is 1. 11 is 1. So for this part, can be divided into one category. What is the XOR problem? Both 0, 0 and 11 are 0. Both 10 and 0, 1 belong to the same category. If we use perceptrons, simple perceptron, it cannot be 0, 0. In other words, one of our perceptrons, essentially, it is a linear model. You can't handle such a non-linear model. How should we proceed then? The simple perceptron cannot solve the XOR problem. So we need to add another layer. Can adding a hidden layer solve? Now let's take a look at this single layer perceptron model. It means there are two more layers of perceptrons. It can also be called a multilayer perceptron. This multilayer perceptron, actually it is a type of feedforward neural network. Let's learn about feedforward neural network. In this neural network, its neurons are arranged hierarchically. We can see that the input nodes do not have computing functions. Just to input one of our feature vectors. After inputting these feature vectors, all the neurons with computing functions are in the hidden layer. These hidden layers all have some activation functions. These activation functions compute and pass on to the next layer. We know the calculated results pass through the output layer. So our neurons are interconnected. Only accept the output of the previous layer, and the calculated result is passed to the next layer. Adopting such a unidirectional multi-layer structure. Each layer contains several neurons. There is no connection between neurons on the same layer. Information between layers, only along one direction. This is an important feature and structural characteristic of our neural network. Since we have added two hidden layers, like this, can effectively solve the XOR problem. Just now, we mentioned, by adding an extra hidden layer, the XOR problem is solved. Let's take a look at how it is resolved. When our input vector actually enters this blue activation function, it can get this blue line. Then, when entering this orange activation function, it can also draw an orange line. So two lines can solve the XOR problem. A perceptron with two layers can effectively solve the XOR problem. Just now, we solved the XOR problem by increasing the layers of neural networks. So as we solve the XOR problem, what kind of conclusion can we draw? In fact, the number of hidden layers has a huge impact on the performance of neural networks. Performance of neural networks. We can increase the number of layers in the neural network to observe its classification effect. When we set the number of hidden layers to 0, let's take a look at its actual boundary line. It is a straight line. When the number of hidden layers, it's actually quite similar to the shape of three straight lines. Then if the hidden layer is 20, it is a curved surface that twists and turns, like this. Better separate our positive and negative classes. One of our models better expresses the distribution of our data. Through this classification effect, what conclusion did we come to? In other words, when our neural network increases its layers to a certain extent, Actually, the more layers you add, the stronger its resolution capability. At this point, I believe everyone has gained a preliminary understanding of deep learning and neural net. In our next lesson, mainly explain how we train our neural network, being able to obtain a relatively good neural network. In this section, we'll stop here. Thank you all for watching. See you in the next class.